thank you so much for joining us on this kickoff as we re-engage the community around the Relief High School and also have the expanded scope to add a Relief Middle School in the south part of the county. So what we're going to cover today is basically a reset and gather the information and share the information that we've collected so far, because we have done a lot of work already around the Relief High School, and share that back with you, go over some fundamental policies that are driving this work, that we're going to be grounded in throughout the process, and share our upcoming steps as we expand the scope and we move forward towards a May vote. So just to go over the purpose and the intended outcomes, so that is clear. So again, we are working on the boundaries for a new high school in the south part of the county to relieve Ardrey Kell, Myers Park, and South Mecklenburg High School. We've also added a new middle school, which is going to open as early as 25-26. And the purpose of doing that is that we currently have overcrowding in these schools, which causes unnecessary traffic, mobile unit use. And by adding these schools, we have an opportunity to create overall better educational environment to the students of CMS. The new buildings are going to be safer, and there's enhanced opportunities for all kinds of extracurricular and athletics participation. So for this slide set today, we're going to be providing information about the process, the timeline that's coming up, get your input, answer any questions that you have, and share the resources that we have. And this is going to mirror the sessions that we're doing publicly today at noon virtually, and also tomorrow evening at Myers Park. And so we'll be sharing all the upcoming public sessions where people can give and give their input and ask their own questions. And I'm going to kick it over to Mr. Schultz.
Thanks so much, Dr. Schuch. Welcome and good morning, everyone. And glad to be here with you and give you this preview. We'll look forward to connecting with you and answering some questions here at the end. As just building upon what Dr. Schuch explained, really the purpose of this phase of the work. We'll kind of have 4 iterations of this. The purpose of this is just really to communicate the timeline and the protocol and the process, so that folks know that we won't be sharing any boundaries at this time or anything like that. That will come in the next iteration. So you can see that we started out prior to winter break discussing the high school, South County Relief High School, that was approved in the 2017 bond. It's scheduled for a fall 24 opening, so that's for the school year 24-25. Is a 100 classroom high school, and you can see its address, and that will significantly decrease the population and relieve the overcrowding at Ardrey Kell, Myers Park, and South Meck. And in addition to that, since we have approved the capital improvement plan, we're going to add in this Relief Middle School, although that will be pending approval of the CIP and the general obligation bond referendum in November. We wanted to go ahead and add in the middle school that's planned to relieve Jam Robinson, Rea Farms, and Community House, so that we don't have to come back and do that again. It will help us line up feeder patterns and not have to come back and do the exact same work that we're doing with the high school, and making sure that we're aligning the middle school feeder patterns to the high schools as well. And then we'll also discuss some of the potentially impacted schools. You'll see a list of the potentially impacted schools. Doesn't mean that all of them will be impacted, but when you see in just a minute that we have our board policies, one of the things that's really important within that board policy is to have intact feeder patterns, so we may have multiple feeder patterns that are impacted, while we may not be aligning any or many elementary school boundaries where those elementary schools send their students will more than likely be impacted when it comes to the feeder patterns. So I mentioned the board policies earlier. So what you'll see here are the board policies that really guide and dictate what we do. Any recommendation that we make to our Board of Education or that you hear a superintendent recommend to the Board of Education will be in line with the board policies that guide this process. I think it's important to know we don't make this up as we go. I mean, we are, as employees of Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, we're obligated to follow the board policy and our recommendation to the superintendent, and subsequently the recommendation of the superintendent to the Board of Education will follow these policies. Former policy JCA, which is now SASGP, you'll see there's kind of three different sections of that. One is that we have contiguous boundaries when we redraw or realign boundaries for new schools. Also, what takes preference within those is home to school distance, intact feeder patterns, SES diversity, as well as utilization. We get asked a lot which one of those matters the most or which one of those weighs the most. We don't weight them. We say that they weigh equally. However, as many of you know, in South Charlotte, we have a booming population and we have some overcrowded schools. So there's times when utilization is very important and may take precedent sometimes because of safety or because of traffic or because of we're out of space to put mobile units or things like that. So and all four of these things kind of play off each other. Sometimes you have to sacrifice home to school distance to get the right utilization, or sometimes that you to get intact feeder patterns, you may have to adjust your SES diversity expectations. So some of these play off of each other, but they are all considered, they're all super important and in alignment with the board policy. Other additional factors for consideration include achieving some of the other board's goals, such as magnet schools, partial magnet schools, full magnet schools, those kinds of things. Keeping entire neighborhoods assigned to the same schools is an additional consideration. Of course, taking in the account for population growth as well as any shifts that we see over time. Just a couple of examples of that in recent history where something was approved in a bond, and then we saw a population growth where we didn't necessarily think there was going to be a population growth, and then we had to adjust and include that school in some of that alignment process. So that does happen. And then, as we talked about a lot in the capital improvement plan process, is that there's, I had to consider all these assumptions, methodologies, and things that get done to us or things that we're required by policy or legislation to do. Sometimes those affect our sites and the limitations that we have there. And then we obviously consider, as I kind of mentioned earlier, what's coming up in that capital improvement plan, what could potentially be in the works in terms of new schools. The other two policies that we talk about frequently with this process are the equity policy, EQU. That's insignificant there in this process: school composition, school facilities, educational opportunities with high expectations, as well as the family and community engagement piece. And then we have the board policy SPOP, which basically charges the superintendent to ensure that they include the community in the boundary formulation process. And then other considerations besides policy that we look at as we go through this process, there's obviously the boundary considerations. There's a facility consideration in terms of capacity, use of space, use of land, those kinds of things. Transportation, it plays a major factor, as many of you know, into this process. And then obviously the community engagement, the amount of community engagement that we're doing, how much we value that input, and how much that actually impacts the final outcome is really, really important to us in this process. And more specifically, I think I talked enough about the boundary piece, but what I'd mentioned there is oftentimes that you see boundaries that are natural and man-made boundaries. So it could be a lake, could be a river, could be a 6-lane highway, it could be a 4-lane highway. So sometimes those natural and man-made pieces play into how we develop our boundaries. We really focus on keeping neighborhoods together. That's why it's really important to hear from the community in the process, and obviously the demography and the development that we're seeing here in Charlotte. In terms of facilities, things that we consider, as mentioned previously, is just the capital planning piece and the execution of that. The timing, obviously, of when a school is going to be built also impacts then when we implement the boundaries. So you can see that, with a middle school that would open in the school year 25-26, we obviously wouldn't implement those boundaries until that time period. And then again, all the other things, assumption, standards, methodologies. And one thing that we do get asked a lot about is the traffic impact. And we hear a lot about that. Like, do we consider that? Well, absolutely. And in fact, we're required to consider that. We have to issue a TIA, a traffic impact analysis, working with CDOT, NCDOT, and basically what NCDOT approves, or what NCDOT tells us we have to do before they'll actually approve the school to open. So that does weigh heavily in. And if they tell us to put in a stoplight, we put in a stoplight. If they tell us to put in a roundabout, we put in a roundabout. So that really is one of those things that's guided by the North Carolina Department of Transportation. And then obviously, speaking of transportation, that factors into that. So we look at things such as run length, the number of students in the boundary, the distance from home to school, which kind of harkens back to the policy. And then our bell schedules are largely dictated by our bus runs. Our buses run 3 tiers typically in the morning and the afternoon. So they'll, essentially they will have a bus that runs an early start time, a middle start time, and a late start time, so we can maximize the use of that bus. And then obviously that driver that's how they get their 8 hours a day, by running what we call a triple tier process for transportation, which is why we have different bell times, so that we can maximize in the buses that we have, and then utilize the drivers that we have to drive them. And then lastly, the community engagement piece that plays a factor in this. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, we really have kind of four phases of this phase 2, 4 iterations, if you will, of this phase 2, a reset phase, which is what we are in right now. So we're just setting the timeline, process, and dates. And then we'll see a draft in late March. You'll see a draft of the first high school boundary, and you'll see a draft of the first draft of the middle school boundary. We'll seek feedback on those drafts. We'll come back to the community again for a second draft. We'll seek feedback on that. And then the second, or the fourth and final phase of this is a public board hearing, where the community will be able to weigh in once again as we make our final recommendation to the board. So we really kind of cycled in 4 segments, or 4 iterations, if you will, or opportunities for our community to provide feedback to us in this process. And so I'll turn it over to Dr. Schuch for a review of what we learned in phase 1 prior to December, when we engaged the high school community for the South Relief High School.
Great, thank you so much. So when we say phase 1, we refer to the work that we've been doing in 2022. And so in the fall, we held over 11 school-based meetings, and we also had several surveys, the last of which had almost 1,000 respondents. And then we also received hundreds of emails from people. And so we looked at all the different results and themes, and were able to pull out the main ones that I'd like to share back with you in terms of what we've been hearing. So there was actually very high satisfaction rate in terms of people's current school assignments. They like being having a school that's close to where they live, and for their kids to be able to go to school with their neighborhood friends. They appreciate their current feeder pattern, and also really liked the general school quality and the teachers and staff at their schools and the leadership at their schools. So that's a great testament to all the amazing work that our principals and teachers and staff are doing at the schools. There were concerns about overcrowding and traffic, which ties into why we need these new schools in the first place. And then there were also concerns about split feeds. And so we have actually quite a few split feeds that we're trying to address right now, where an elementary school or a middle school feed into multiple different schools. And so trying to resolve for that. And then also we're concerned about legacy enrollment, or what we have also referred to as grandfathering. And so this means who gets to stay at their school versus who is going to the new school or the newly assigned school. So we'll touch upon that in a little bit as well. And then so the top concerns and hesitations that were received regarding the new school, mainly on the forefront of the social and academic impacts on students. And so we fully understand that it's really hard to transition school, especially in this era where we're still recovering from COVID, and the students who are going to be impacted in this have also been heavily impacted by COVID in their middle school years particularly. So really keeping that in mind and seeing what we can do best to make the transition easier, or figure out how to limit the amount of students that have to go through a transition to minimize these socio-emotional and academic impacts. Then, of course, there's uncertainty about not knowing what a new school will be like. We trust that the new schools are going to be amazing and up to the same standards as the other schools in the area. And we've seen, as recent as this year, Palisades high school opening, and they've done a phenomenal job. And so we anticipate that can be replicated, but at the same time, there are obviously uncertainties and what the impact will be on athletics and on extracurriculars, as well as not knowing necessarily the bell schedules. And then we also heard concerns about socioeconomic status diversity. And so what that is referring to is, obviously we have a lot of concentrated wealth in the south part of the county, and making sure that we have schools that are as balanced as they can be in terms of socioeconomic status, given that there's a lot of research about having students learn together from across different income levels promotes a better learning environment for all students. And so when it comes to the school selection, what parents found to be most important are the school staff and the course offerings, and then also home to school distance, intact feeder patterns, and a continuity of academic pathways for their students. And so these are particular things that we want to be paying attention to. Then next, we asked about the hopes and ideas for the new relief school. And some of the things that came up were, again, keeping the SES balance, socioeconomic status balance, in particular at a school like South Meck, for instance, that has more of a diverse student population, making sure we're maintaining that and not tipping it one way or another. Making sure that we're accounting for residential growth. So understanding that there is a lot of development still happening in this area. And to the extent that we can, because we don't control the residential growth, making sure that we're really accounting for that, leaving space, and considering the fact that these schools will continue to grow. Again, the question was, can we figure out a way to allow juniors to stay or have a stability plan for the juniors, considering this is a pivotal year in high school? And then generally people asked about where they could go for information. So we want to make sure that information is readily available. I posted the link in the chat here, and it will be at the end of this presentation as well, where people can go. The site will continue to be updated with all the latest information. And then also overall, people are just envisioning the school to have the same quality of advanced coursework and staff, teachers and leadership as the other schools in the area.
All right, thanks so much, Dr. Schuch. All right, so we're going to look at the timeline and our next steps when it comes to community engagement and decisions that we're going to make. So here you can see the potentially impacted middle and high schools. Of course, when we approve a bond, we acknowledge what the relief school is for. So within that, within the 2017 bond, we acknowledge that relief was for Ardrey Kell, Myers Park, and South Meck. But as I indicated earlier, sometimes we may need to make adjustments to other boundaries as well. This is being very inclusive of potential. Doesn't mean that we will change the boundaries of the other schools, but we could potentially be doing that in the process as well as we follow our board policy in the process. These are the K-8 and the middle schools that could potentially be impacted. And then you'll see the list of the 27 elementary schools. Again, emphasizing the fact that these elementary schools, not necessarily focusing on the boundaries per se, but really looking at those feeder patterns within those elementary schools as students matriculate to middle and high school. We are working with a community work group to get feedback. We have representatives from each of the elementary, middle, and high schools that you just saw that are providing some insight and feedback as we go through this process. It's just a way to get additional feedback from parents outside of the community work, the group sessions, another opportunity to hear more feedback. And the role of that community work group is essentially to provide and share communications, and then provide feedback on draft scenarios. So as these community work group members are on, that have a leadership role, parental leadership role, such as a school leadership team or PTSA or PTSO boards, they have some networks and will help relay some of the websites that we've shared with you, the resources that we'll be sharing along. So there's just another voice that can help with the communication. I will say what they don't do is they don't vote in this process. They are not the final decision makers in this process. That's our Board of Education, but they do provide invaluable feedback, as do the remainder of the community through the community sessions. So we do have a community work group involved with this, and then here you'll kind of see the 4 iterations of this process. Again, at each one of those iterations, you'll see as an opportunity for feedback from our community. We are in this reset phase now. Obviously at noon, we will be going live with our first Zoom session to the community to review this very same slide deck that you're reviewing with us. And then tomorrow night at Mars Park, we'll be hosting this very same session again. So it's just, again, an opportunity for folks that maybe did not get to see the recording that we're going to do of this and or attend the Zoom session today. And then, as I said earlier, at the end of March, that last week of March, we'll put out the first draft of the high school boundary and the middle school boundary. We do acknowledge and appreciate that we received a lot of feedback on the high school boundaries. We put out 3 drafts back prior to winter break, and so the information that we gleaned from all the feedback through that process will feed into that one draft that we'll be recommending for this first round for the high school. And of course, the one with the middle school will be the first draft of the middle school that anybody has seen. So we have 2 sessions for that, Park South Mech, that are face-to-face, and then we have a virtual on March 30th. You'll see shortly after spring break, we'll be re-engaging on a second draft. We'll have face-to-face sessions both at Ardrey Kell and Providence High Schools, and then 2 virtual sessions during that time frame as well. And then lastly is the final phase, and that's the board recommendation phase, and that we will be presenting the report to the recommendation to the board on May 9th. That will include a public hearing following that presentation. And then on May 23rd is the time for the board vote. And then just a couple of resources that we have. So this is the site that Claire put in the chat box for you all. This is the URL code, the URL as well as the code for it. And then we also have a feedback form. I like to direct all the feedback and all the communications to this form so that we have that in one place and can capture that and start making themes out of that and to inform our next steps and our formulation. So I'd like to go back to this and just give you a real quick preview of the site. So what you'll see is just the updated portion of what we just described to you on our website. And then there are 3 drop-down menus, and there's where you see all of the dates that I communicated to you in terms of community engagement dates with the URLs for the Zoom sessions. And that is listed under the community engagement link up here under presentation and resources. This is the location where we'll post the recording of this session, as well as the slide deck of this session will be located here. And then the community questions and feedback form is what I just shared with you as well. So that if you click on that, that takes you to this feedback form. That's both in English and in Spanish.